Great Responsibility, Chapter 15, Subway Chase. Piper couldn't seem to catch a break these days. She dodged left, pulling the spider cycle up onto the wall of the subway tunnel. She'd picked up a stray giant robot on 14th Street and hadn't been able to shake him. She rolled her eyes as she dodged again, the robot forcing her to drive on the ceiling. She sped out of the main tunnel and past a station full of people. They all looked up in awe, but she didn't have time to enjoy it. "Get down!" The crowd screamed and ducked as the thing came smashing its way out after Spidey. Piper couldn't help but think that maybe she was jinxed when it came to robotics. Every robot she had ever met had at some point turned on her, except for Jarvis. Jarvis was cool. She sped away from the robot and felt something jab into her shoulder. She swatted the arm away and glared at the robot. "Rude!" A hollow screen on her bike flickered from the normal readouts to the annoyed face of Nick Fury, director of S.H.I.E.L.D.
"Spider-Girl, are you fighting that thing or playing with it?"
Piper contemplated his question for a moment as she dodged another arm. "Can I get back to you on that, Nick?" He rolled his eye.
"You have weapons. Use them."
Piper drove the bike back down the wall. "Yeah, untested weapons, electro webs, not sounding safe." Fury let out a long, suffering sigh.
"Hence, they are weapons."
Spidey nodded slightly. Fair point. She swiveled in her seat and fired at the robot, but it moved faster than she expected, dodging out of the way. Spidey groaned as her own web pulled her off her bike, and the robot grabbed her around the waist and slammed her into the railing, pinning down both her arms and legs. Of course, right then the lights from an incoming subway began to light up the tunnel as the driver of the train laid on the horn. Piper glanced over at the third rail. "Oh, this will be pain." She shot a web, attaching it to the third rail, then pressed her wrist back just a touch more, activating the electro-web function on her new web shooters. She screamed as electricity coursed through her and up into the robot. The mechanical monstrosity convulsed and released its grip on her. Piper leapt off the rails and onto the ceiling, holding on tight as the robot was smashed to pieces on the tracks. Piper found her bike doing wheelies to entertain the kids on the platform. She whistled, and it raced through the crowd, parking in front of her. She swore it had a rudimentary AI that Doc Connors hadn't told her about. She swung her leg over the bike as cameras flashed all around her. She grinned under her mask. "Remember, kids, don't try this at home." Then she sped off up the side of one of the columns and back into the tunnel, back the way she had come. Soon she reached the roof, where she'd stashed her clothes. She peeled off the suit's gloves and rolled up her sleeves. There was a tiny pinprick, but it was disappearing quickly. What the hell did that thing want, anyway? Dude, I'm starting to think robots just hate me. She pulled on her shirt and shook her head, stowing the gloves and mask safely in the secret compartment of her bag. She scaled down the fire escape and took off towards the school. She almost made it before the doors slammed shut, locking her out. Piper slid down the doors. Crap. Like today wasn't already going swimmingly. She heard a whistle and looked up to see Harry Osborn leaning out of a now open window. She grinned and scrambled in through the window, making a show of needing some help. Harry pulled her inside and helped her to her feet, grinning.
"Seriously, I am buying you a watch for your birthday. Maybe a watch company."
Piper laughed. Harry was always there when she needed someone. Piper was the school punching bag, be it Flash Thompson or Liz Allen and her cronies. Harry always had her back, and thankfully extra outerwear for days Liz and her cronies broke into her locker and stole her clothes. Harry grinned, walking backwards in front of her.
"Seriously, there are days I think you'd forget where you live if Happy didn't drive you home. Just don't be late tonight."
Piper's face scrunched up in confusion. "Tonight?" Harry rolled his eyes.
"See what I mean? Scatterbrained. My dad's going out of town. The penthouse is open for a movie marathon with you, me, and MJ."
Piper grinned, but before she could reply, Ava popped up at her elbow and grinned. "Hello, do you mind if we borrow Piper for a teensy minute?" Danny and Luke had popped up on either side of Piper. Does it have to be now? I'm talking to Harry. Sam grabbed her sleeve and yanked, pulling her behind him. Parker, talk, now. Piper shouted over her shoulder, Sorry, Harry, I'll catch you at lunch. Sam tugged her around the corner and the others followed close behind. Harry sighed, kicking at a piece of crumpled paper on the ground. He was starting to wonder if he'd ever get the chance to tell Piper how he felt. A hand landed on his shoulder. He looked into the face of his other best friend. MJ smiled at him sadly. It's okay, Harry. You'll get your chance. I know you will. Harry smiled back. Thanks, MJ. Chapter 16. An Old Friend. Piper handed Ava back her phone as Jameson's latest rant against Spider-Girl ended. She raised an eyebrow at her gathered team. So? Jameson never lays off me. This is supposed to be news? Nova rolled his eyes and Ava spoke up. So, why did we have to hear about this from Fury and not you? Piper pulled a book out of her locker, depositing her backpack as she did. You guys aren't my mommy and daddies. I don't have to tell you what I'm doing at all times. Danny shook his head. Stand together or fall alone. Piper rolled her eyes. And that's another thing. I agreed to help with this program if and only if my time stayed mine. And you guys yanking me away in the middle of a conversation with my best friend counts as cutting into my time, unless it's for an actual emergency. Seriously, I barely know any of you. We aren't friends yet. That's something you have to earn. Piper slammed her locker closed and walked away, missing the slightly hurt looks on her team's faces. She still wasn't sure about this whole team thing. They'd done okay against the Frightful Four, but the others' lack of experience or care for civilian safety was worrying. Piper wasn't paying attention to where she was walking and ran straight into the back of what she thought for a moment was Flash. Her books fell from her hands, papers scattering all over the floor. She muttered a quick sorry and knelt to pick up her papers. The guy she'd bumped into turned and knelt to help her gather up her papers. He handed her a small stack of calculus notes with a smile. He was blonde, like Flash, but he was missing the ever-present Letterman jacket. His smile was much warmer than Flash's, and his sparkling blue eyes were familiar. Piper stood, taking the hand he offered to help her. Thanks. Sorry about that. I wasn't looking where I was going. The smile never wavered. It's okay. He looked so familiar, Piper couldn't help herself. Have we met? The smile grew wider. I was hoping you'd recognize me, Pipes. I know it's been a long time, but hey, a guy can dream. The nickname was what made it click. It had been what Uncle Ben had called her, and her friends had adopted it up until she was 11, when her uncle had died. But one of her closest friends had been forced to move away before her uncle had died. Tears stung the corners of her eyes. Eddie? He held out his arms, and Piper practically ran him over with the force of her hug. Hey, Pipes, it's good to see you. Eddie's parents had worked with Piper's, had died in the same plane crash. But unlike Piper, Eddie hadn't had any relatives to take him in. He'd been a ward of the state, and when he was 11 and Piper was 10, the orphanage he'd been living in had been shut down. He'd left, and Piper hadn't seen him since. Piper took a step back, swiping at her eyes with her sleeve. Eddie, what are you doing here? He grinned. I go here now. The teacher behind them, Mr. Monroe, Piper's advanced calculus teacher, cleared his throat. I'm glad you two know each other. I was going to ask Piper here to show you around the school, give you the tour and all that. Will that be a problem, Miss Parker? Piper shook her head. Absolutely not, Mr. Monroe. Mr. Monroe smiled. Very good. I'll make your excuses with Miss Quinn. Get going. I expect you to be present for that test in 5th period. Piper nodded, and Eddie held out his arm. Piper threaded her arm through his, and they walked off, Piper pointing out different classrooms along the way. Harry was getting worried. Piper hadn't shown up in their shared English class. They didn't have any classes together after that until after lunch. She'd said she'd find him at lunch. They always did. Piper, Harry, and MJ always sat at the same table, just the three of them. Harry grabbed his tray and collected his food before looking around the cafeteria. He spotted Piper's short crop of chestnut hair easily and grinned slightly relieved. He was halfway to her when he spotted the tall, muscular blonde sitting next to her. He froze. MJ raised an eyebrow at him, then spotted the boy sitting next to Piper. Her jaw went slack for a moment. Then she grinned and pulled Harry over to the table. "Eddie, is that you?" The boy looked up and smiled broadly. He hugged MJ, and Piper beamed at Harry. That smile did funny things to his heart. He grinned and sat down across from her. "So, this is the infamous Eddie Brock." Eddie nodded and held out his hand to shake Harry's.
"That's right. You must be Harry. Piper's told me quite a bit about you."
Piper blushed slightly, and Harry felt like doing a happy dance. She'd told him about Eddie Brock, how they were like brother and sister until he'd been forced to move. Harry felt a bit less threatened, now that he knew who this man was. They were all interrupted when Flash Thompson popped up out of nowhere, shoving between Piper and Eddie. Piper slipped and fell off the bench, her tray mysteriously following her down. It landed on her shirt, and Flash's girlfriend Liz laughed loudly as Piper tried to wipe gravy off her white shirt.
"So, you're a new guy, huh? Word of advice. Don't hang out with losers. And you might actually make something of yourself."
Eddie's hands curled into fist.
"Good advice. Guess I won't be hanging out with you then."
The whole cafeteria went quiet as Flash went red in anger. Only Harry noticed Piper's detention buddies, the blonde one, and tall one who was more muscular than even Flash, helping her up. The small Latino was glaring daggers at Flash. The only other girl in their little group looked like she was going to murder him. Harry stood and swung off his jacket, swinging it around Piper's shoulders. "Great, another member of the losers squad. Have fun being a nerd." Flash walked off, red in the face. He sneered at Piper as he passed. The girl and boy who weren't still standing on either side of her stepped in front of her. Flash stalked off. "Thanks for your help." The blonde nodded. "A friend in need." Piper flinched slightly. The girl held out a hand. "Come on, I've got a spare shirt in my locker." The small group walked off with Piper in tow. Eddie turned to MJ, who was fuming. "Does that happen often?" MJ stabbed her peas and nodded. Harry sat back down. "Nearly daily. Though he likes to switch up how he bullies her." Eddie raised an eyebrow.
"And you haven't done anything about it?"
MJ kept stabbing her food, not really interested in eating it anymore. "Of course we've tried. But none of the teachers will do anything about it. He's their star quarterback. They can't suspend him without worrying about how the football team will fail without him." Eddie pushed away his tray. "That's bullshit." Harry nodded, eyes still on the doors they had left through. "Yeah, but I guess she's got her detention friends now." Eddie raised an eyebrow. "Baby Piper in detention? Now this I've got to hear." Ava led Piper and the boys back to her locker and rummaged around before pulling out a few shirts and pulling Piper into the girls' room. The boys stood watch outside as Ava helped her pick out a new shirt and then ushered her into one of the stalls. "Ava, about what I said earlier." Ava cut her off. "Water under the bridge. None of us were particularly happy when we joined the team either. Except Sam, when he still thought he was leader." Piper snorted. "Still, everyone deserves a chance, and I wasn't willing to give you guys that. Forgive me and try again?" Piper stepped out of the stall in a floaty blue blouse that hid the top of the Spider-Girl costume nicely, Harry's jacket still around her shoulders. Ava smiled. "Absolutely." Piper stepped out of the bathroom and apologized to the rest of the team, and they all agreed that they had gotten off on the wrong foot and should try again. Sam had to be prodded by Danny and Luke, but that was more than likely due to the fact that Piper had embarrassed him a bit the day before by shooting down his idea to go after an A-list villain without permission or provocation. In hindsight, he realized it would have been nearly suicidal to do so, but he'd wanted to show off. They wandered off to class, and MJ caught up to Piper.